The summer night in San Diego was warm and cloudless. The full moon bathed the surroundings in its silvery glow, casting long shadows on sidewalks and buildings. 5 teenagers, Jake, Emily, Tyler, Zoe, and Alex, stealthily approached the high fence of the local zoo. Their hearts raced with a mixture of fear and excitement. Jake, the informal leader of the group, was the first to reach the fence. He pulled wire cutters from his backpack and began carefully cutting the wire. The others nervously looked around, fearing they might be spotted. Finally, Jake made an opening large enough for them to slip through. One by one, the teenagers infiltrated the zoo grounds. They had been planning this excursion for weeks, dreaming of adventure and the chance to see exotic animals up close. But none of them could have predicted that this night would forever change their lives. At first, everything seemed normal. They crept past empty food kiosks and souvenir shops, heading towards the animal enclosures. The silence was almost unnatural, only occasionally broken by the distant cry of a bird or a rustle in the bushes. The first signs that something was amiss appeared when they reached the primate section. The cages were empty, but traces of blood and tufts of fur were visible on the bars. The teenagers exchanged worried glances, but decided to press on. Near the lion enclosure, they were met with a horrible stench. Half-eaten antelope carcasses lay on the ground, but the lions themselves were nowhere to be seen. Suddenly, a low growl emanated from the darkness. It didn't sound like a normal lion's roar. There was something unnatural, almost mechanical about it. Panic-stricken, the teenagers took off running. They zigzagged between enclosures, trying to find an exit. But each turn brought new horrors. By the seal pool, they saw a huge amphibian that resembled a hybrid of a crocodile and an octopus. The creature was slowly crawling out of the water, leaving a slimy trail behind it. In the reptile section, snakes with multiple heads stared at them from glass terrariums. Their forked tongues flicked out in unison, as if sniffing the scent of fear emanating from the teenagers. But the worst awaited them in that nocturnal predator's pavilion. When they ran in, hoping to hide, they found themselves surrounded by a pack of creatures that were once bats. Now they were dog-sized beings with sharp fangs and claws capable of tearing flesh. Their eyes glowed neon green in the darkness. Alex, the youngest of the group, stumbled and fell. One of the flying creatures instantly pounced on him. The other teenagers, paralyzed with horror, watched as their friend disappeared under a pile of aggressive mutants. Alex's screams snapped them out of their stupor. Jake grabbed the nearest object, a flagpole, and began fending off the animals. Emily found a fire extinguisher and directed the foam stream at the swarm. This gave them a few precious seconds to pull Alex out and flee the pavilion. They ran blindly, hearing the sounds of pursuit behind them. It seemed the entire zoo had transformed into a nightmarish labyrinth full of mutated predators. Every corner held a new danger. Giant spiders weaving webs between trees, monkeys with extra limbs leaping from branch to branch, even butterflies whose wings were covered in poisonous spines. Finally, they saw the main entrance, but the gates were locked, and the guard appeared to have long since abandoned his post. Tyler, the tallest of the group, boosted the others over the fence. They had almost escaped when they heard a loud roar. Turning around, they saw a massive figure approaching them. It was an elephant, but its skin was covered in hard plates resembling armor, and its tusks glowed with a phosphorescent light. Jake, the last of the group, barely managed to climb over the fence when the elephant struck it with its trunk. The metal bent but held. The teenagers fell onto the sidewalk on the other side of the fence, breathing heavily and not believing they were still alive. They ran through the city streets, not stopping until they reached a safe place. Only then could they assess the magnitude of what they had experienced. Alex was seriously injured and needed medical attention, but they were afraid to go to the hospital. Who would believe their story? The next day, the news was filled with reports of an incident at the zoo. The official version spoke of a leak of an unknown chemical substance that led to aggressive behavior in the animals. The zoo was closed for quarantine, and the military cordoned off the area. The teenagers silently watched these reports, knowing that the truth was far more terrifying. They made a pact never to tell anyone about what they had seen that night, but nightmares haunted them for years to come, reminding them of the horrors lurking behind the walls of an ordinary city zoo. Mike Donovan had been working as a night guard at Brookfield Zoo in suburban Chicago for over 10 years. During this time, he had grown accustomed to the nocturnal sounds of animals, the dark shadows cast by trees in the moonlight, and the quiet rustle of leaves in the wind. But this night was different. It started as a typical shift. Mike arrived at the zoo at 10:00 p.m., relieved the day security, and began his usual rounds. The first few hours passed without incident. He checked the primate pavilions, walked past the predator enclosures, and peeked into the reptile house. All was quiet. Around 2:00 a.m., Mike noticed something strange. Passing by the lion enclosure, he didn't hear the usual purring of the big cats. Shining his flashlight inside, he discovered with horror that the cage was empty. The enclosure doors were wide open. Mike's heart began to race. He rushed to the neighboring enclosures. Tigers, panthers, wolves. All the cages were empty, doors ajar. Panic gripped him as he realized the scale of the situation. With trembling hands, Mike pulled out his radio to call for help, but only static noise came from the speaker. His mobile phone wasn't working either. The screen remained black, no matter how many times he tried to turn it on. Suddenly, a sound echoed in the distance, similar to a lion's roar, but somehow unnatural, distorted. It was followed by a howl that made Mike's blood run cold. This wasn't the sound of any animal he knew. The guard knew he had to act. He decided to make his way to the administration building, where there was a landline phone and a video surveillance system. Perhaps there he could figure out what had happened and call for help. Mike moved through the dark zoo alleys, trying to step as quietly as possible. Every rustle, every crack of a twig under his feet made him flinch. He constantly looked over his shoulder, feeling as if someone was watching him. Passing by the aviary, Mike noticed strange movement in the sky. Huge shadows soared above the trees, occasionally obscuring the moon. Their outlines didn't resemble any of the birds kept in the zoo. It seemed as if giant bats were circling in the night sky. Approaching the center of the zoo, Mike heard the splash of water. The sound came from the sea lion pool. Turning his flashlight in that direction, he saw something that made him freeze in place. A huge head emerged from the water, resembling a crocodile's but much larger. Behind it appeared a long, snake-like body. The creature was slowly crawling onto the shore, leaving a wet trail behind it. Mike felt his legs weaken. He wanted to run, but fear paralyzed him. At that moment, something large rushed past him, nearly knocking him off his feet. In the flashlight's beam, he caught only a blurred silhouette, resembling a big cat, but with unnaturally long limbs. Gathering all his willpower, Mike dashed towards the administration building. He ran faster than he ever had in his life, hearing strange pursuit sounds behind him. Something large and heavy was moving after him, breaking bushes and knocking down trees. Finally, gasping for breath, Mike reached the building. With shaking hands, he pulled out his keys and unlocked the door. Running inside, he immediately locked all the locks. In the darkness of the office, Mike fumbled for the light switch. When the light flashed on, he barely suppressed a scream. All the walls were covered with some strange, pulsating substance. It resembled a web, but was much thicker and seemed to glow with a faint phosphorescent light. Mike ran to the phone, but it was dead. The screens of the video surveillance system showed only static. He was trapped. Suddenly, something heavy struck the door. The blow repeated, stronger this time. The door creaked, threatening to break. Mike retreated to the corner of the room, realizing he had nowhere to run. At that moment, he noticed something strange. The pulsating substance on the walls began to move, gathering in one place. It was forming some kind of figure that was becoming increasingly human-like. The door crashed down with a thunderous bang. In the opening appeared a huge figure. It was an elephant, but its skin was covered with hard plates, and its tusks glowed with a red light. Behind it loomed other distorted animals: lions with additional limbs, snakes with multiple heads, birds with unnaturally long beaks. Mike closed his eyes, bracing for the worst. But suddenly, a loud, piercing sound rang out, making the walls tremble. The animals retreated, emitting sounds of pain. When Mike opened his eyes, he saw that the figure on the wall had transformed into something resembling a portal. Bright light emanated from it, and some force was pulling all the mutated animals inside. In a matter of seconds, it was all over. The portal disappeared, and with it, all the horrific creatures. The zoo once again plunged into silence. Mike spent the rest of the night trembling in the corner of the office. When morning came and the first employees arrived, they found him there, pale and unable to speak. The police and security services searched the zoo but found no traces of the night's events. All the animals were in their places, cages locked. The only evidence that something had happened were the broken doors of the administration building and strange tracks on the ground that didn't match any known animal. Mike Donovan never returned to work at the zoo. He moved away from the city, trying to forget that terrible night. But every time he heard about strange events in zoos around the world, he shuddered, knowing that somewhere out there, in the darkness, creatures that shouldn't exist were waiting for their time. Jeremy Foster had been working as a night keeper at Silver Creek Zoo, located on the outskirts of a small town in Oregon, for 5 years. During this time, he had grown accustomed to the nocturnal sounds of animals and believed he knew every corner of the zoo like the back of his hand. But the night of the full moon in October changed everything he knew about his job and the world around him. Jeremy's shift began as usual. He arrived at the zoo at 8:00 p.m., when the last visitors had already left and the day staff was finishing up their work. After receiving a report from the day shift, Jeremy began his usual rounds. The night was unusually warm for October. A full moon hung in the sky, bathing the zoo grounds in silvery light. Jeremy walked along familiar paths, checking the locks on cages and enclosures. All was quiet, with only the occasional cry of a night bird or rustle in the bushes breaking the silence. Around midnight, Jeremy approached the wolf enclosure. Usually at this time, they were already asleep, but tonight something was off. The wolves were restless, circling their enclosure and emitting soft whimpers. Jeremy directed his flashlight beam inside, trying to understand what was happening. Suddenly, one of the wolves stopped and looked directly at Jeremy. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural yellow light. Jeremy recoiled but couldn't look away. Before his eyes, the wolf's body began to change. The fur seemed to retract under the skin, the paws elongated, transforming into arms and legs. In a matter of seconds, where the wolf had stood was now a humanoid creature covered in remnants of gray fur. Jeremy's heart was pounding wildly. He couldn't believe his eyes. But this was just the beginning. Looking around, he saw that similar transformations were occurring in other enclosures. Lions, tigers, bears, they were all changing, taking on bizarre humanoid forms. Panic gripped Jeremy. He ran towards the administration building, hoping to call for help. But his path was blocked by a massive figure. It was an elephant, but not quite an elephant anymore. It stood on 2 legs, its trunk transformed into something resembling an arm with long fingers. The creature's eyes glowed with the same yellow light as the wolf's. Jeremy abruptly turned and ran in the opposite direction. He heard heavy footsteps and the crunch of breaking branches behind him. Passing by the aviary, he noticed that even the birds hadn't escaped the transformation. Huge humanoid creatures with wings instead of arms were flying out of the enclosures, rising into the night sky. Finally, Jeremy reached the reptile house. He quickly ran inside and locked the door behind him. With trembling hands, he took out his phone, trying to call the police. But the screen showed no signal. Through the glass walls of the terrariums, Jeremy saw snakes and lizards also beginning to change, their bodies elongated, taking on human outlines. He realized that even here, he wasn't safe. Running out of the reptile house, Jeremy saw that the entire zoo had transformed into a nightmarish version of itself. Bizarre creatures roamed everywhere, half human, half animal. They moved clumsily, as if getting used to their new bodies. Jeremy tried to sneak towards the zoo exit, but suddenly he heard a loud roar. Turning around, he saw a huge gorilla still in the process of transformation. Its body had doubled in size, its muscles taking on incredible proportions. But the most terrifying thing was its face. It was almost human, distorted by a grimace of pain and fury. The gorilla noticed Jeremy and lunged at him. He ran with all his might, weaving between trees and buildings. Behind him, he could hear heavy breathing and the sound of breaking branches. Jeremy felt the creature gaining on him. At the last moment, he noticed a small service tunnel he had almost forgotten about. This tunnel led outside the zoo. Jeremy dashed for it, barely managing to slip inside before the gorilla's massive hand tried to grab him. Crawling through the tunnel, Jeremy could hear the creature trying to follow him, but the tunnel was too narrow for it. Finally, he emerged outside, finding himself beyond the zoo's boundaries. Jeremy ran through the city streets, not stopping until he reached the police station. Gasping for breath, he tried to explain what had happened, but the officers just looked at him with disbelief. When the police finally arrived at the zoo, everything looked normal. The animals were peacefully sleeping in their enclosures, with no signs of destruction or escape. Jeremy couldn't believe his eyes. Had it all just been a hallucination? But when he looked up at the sky, he noticed that the full moon was still hanging there, as if watching him. And at that moment, Jeremy realized this wasn't the end. Next full moon, it would all happen again. From that day on, Jeremy never returned to work at the zoo. He moved as far away from Silver Creek as he could, trying to forget that horrific night. But every time he saw a full moon, an unspeakable terror gripped him, because he knew, somewhere out there, in the darkness, creatures that shouldn't exist were waiting for their hour. And only a thin line between day and night, between reality and nightmare, was holding them back from breaking into our world.